Good evening, everybody. Thank you for staying tight while we waited for people to trickle in. And thank you especially for coming out and braving electrical storms, thunderstorms, tornado warnings, and everything else. We really appreciate you being here. I'm Lissa Muscatine with my husband, Brad Graham. I'm one of the new owners of Politics Prose. And on behalf of our fantastic staff, we welcome you all here tonight. This is one of about 475 author events that we do at the store every year. And we believe it's part of our mission as a great independent bookstore to do these events and bring authors to our community and our community to them. And really to provide not just great books for people to read, but also a place and a space and a forum for public discourse. Before we get started, let me also thank C-SPAN for bringing this event to a wider audience. We're glad you're here. And let me just give you a few rules of the road in case you've not been to one of our events before. Our guests will speak, and after that, she will take questions. If you could go to, I guess we only have one microphone tonight right here. Please say your name as a courtesy and ask your question. She will answer questions for about 20 minutes or a half hour or so. After that, she'll sign books. You can come up here and she will sign going in this direction. We also ask you two favors. One, please fold up your chairs at the end and stack them on the bookshelf. That will really make life easier for our staff. And also, if you have a cell phone on now, if you would not mind silencing it, that would be much appreciated. In introducing our speaker tonight, Kathryn McGarr, and her book, The Whole Damn Deal, let me just begin by saying that not too many people have famous great uncles. And fewer still have famous great uncles and then decide to write books about them. But Kathryn has done just that, chronicling the life of, and I'm not really sure how I'm supposed to describe Bob Strauss, because in this book there's a whole catalog of things that he did not like to be called. He was not a lobbyist, he was not a fixer, he was not an influence peddler, but I suspect that he would agree and probably take great pleasure in being identified tonight as one of the truly great and iconic figures of American politics during the last chunk of the 20th century. Many of you may know Bob Strauss, worked for him, worked against him. Many who do know him have probably been cajoled by him, certainly insulted by him, which of course was a compliment of sorts. And you no doubt, as my friend Sarah Ehrman was telling me earlier, have your own stories of the many pots he stirred throughout his career. But whether or not you have ever met him, know him in any capacity at all, you will certainly get to know him very well or better by reading this wonderful book, The Whole Damn Deal. Through prodigious research, interviews with key players, including the protagonist, and along with the very hard work necessary to write a good book, Kathryn has captured the man and his time, and, at least in my case, reminded readers how much our political life and our political discourse has changed since Bob Strauss's heyday. And I think, some of us who have lived through that era and are living through now kind of shake our heads and say, isn't there something missing these days? And maybe a lot. So I really am delighted to welcome a first-time author, Kathryn McGarr. She will tell us the story of how this biography came to be and a lot more about her famous great uncle. So thank you so much for being here. Please join me in welcoming Kathryn.
Thank you very much, Lissa, and Lissa and Brad for having me, and everyone at Politics Prose and C-SPAN, and thank you all for being here, because I know it's a miserable night out, and I really appreciate it. So Lissa and I were talking about how do you write a book about your famous great uncle and remain in the family, and also write an accurate book. And the way I tried to get around that was doing a lot of research, especially at presidential libraries and at National Archives, because the Uncle Bob, as we call him in my family, that I knew growing up is very different from the man in the book. And people ask me all the time, what surprised you most about Bob? What did you learn that was so surprising? And I kept trying to think of some really great, smart answer, and I never came up with one. But I think the thing that surprised me most was how much power he had. He was just such a powerful player in Washington, and when I was a child during his heyday, so I never really got to see that. And when he's with his family, he's a different person. When he's with his grandchildren, it's about his grandchildren. It's not about him, and he's not the big personality. And one of his grandchildren told me that they didn't even know that he'd won the Presidential Medal of Freedom until they saw it sitting on his shelf and asked him what that was. So he was a little more modest with his own family. I did spend my 7th birthday in Spaso House, which is the ambassador's residence in Moscow. This was when George H.W. Bush appointed Bob ambassador to the Soviet Union at a critical time when it was crumbling. Bob landed there in the middle of the coup when Yeltsin was rallying people, and he went over there, ambassador to the Soviet Union, and he came back around Christmas time, and he was ambassador to Russia. And he always said, "I think I'm the only fellow who's been fired as ambassador from 12 countries." So that was the Uncle Bob. I did not know that Uncle Bob had flown into a coup. I just knew that he got me a pink cake for my 7th birthday. So I began writing this book at the Columbia Journalism School. I took a book class with Sam Friedman. And I think that where Bob wielded the most power and where he made one of his biggest marks on history was in keeping the Democratic Party together from 1972 to 1976. And that was when the party was really torn apart, starting in 1968 after the debacle at the 1968 Chicago Convention and the assassinations of RFK and Martin Luther King. And the party was splintering over Vietnam and a number of issues. And he came in and really held the party together, first as treasurer of the Democratic National Committee, and then as chairman of the Democratic National Committee. And the Democratic Party then looks a little bit like the Republican Party today in that it's very fractured. And there was sort of, an extreme wing, the McGovernite wing starting in, 72 of the Democrats, and now the Republicans have the Tea Party. But what the Republicans don't have is a Bob Strauss figure. They are still leaderless. They're still fractured. Bob really came in at a key time. And so I started researching his time at the DNC first. That was the first chapter that I wrote. I started in the middle and his election to the chairmanship. And the National Archives has all of the transcripts from the DNC meetings, the executive committee meetings, and these can be some pretty dull reading material. But not when Bob was chairman. Bob was really known around town and around the country because he did become a household name after he was chairman, which you cannot say of Reince Priebus, the current RNC chairman. He was hilarious. So I was laughing in the National Archives, and I think they frown upon everything in the National Archives, but they frowned upon laughing. But Bob was really hilarious, and he went about his job of keeping the party together with a sense of humor, and during this, it was a very controversial election when he became chairman. This was after McGovern lost in 72. Nixon won every single state except Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. So you can imagine, if Nixon did that well, how bad a candidate McGovern turned out to be through no fault of his own. And this was what Bob was up against. And I found this at the Nixon Library. They have recordings of phone calls that Nixon was making with his staff. And one of his aides, Chuck Colson, I think it's a pretty familiar name, was calling the president. They were really tracking this DNC chairmanship election very closely, surprisingly closely. And they were talking about George Mitchell, the senator who became the senator from Maine, very powerful senator from Maine. But at the time, he was in his 30s, and he couldn't compete with Bob. And Chuck Colson said about Mitchell, he's from Maine, he's smart, but he's not a Strauss kind of a guy who really is a powerful, strong, brilliant individual. And when I heard Colson saying that, I was like, what did Bob pay him to say that? And then that was sort of how it was viewed. And then he said, Strauss would normally be the most effective guy they could get, but I think in view of the purge of the McGovernites, it would probably blow up on them, and we're going to win either way. And obviously, Nixon folks did not win either way, because the Watergate scandal, broke White apart, and he ended up out of office. And also, there was no purge of the McGovernites, and that's where Bob was really skilled, because even though he was coming from a more conservative